All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New York University campus in Washington, D.C. for what I'm sure will be a really, really stimulating DC Tech Week panel on dual-use companies and how they navigate their mission, balance their mission, their policy, and the policy space and markets. Welcome to all of you here. I'm really glad that you could join us in person. Welcome to everybody who's joining us for the live stream. And of course, thank you very much to all the panelists who are here this evening to talk about this, what I think is a really interesting topic. We have 4 panelists in total. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. The last one was stuck. It's very unclear still whether it was in a motorcade or because of a motorcade, but she'll be joining us in just a minute, and we'll make sure that she joins our conversation when she's here. So we're here tonight to talk about the complex world of dual-use companies and how they navigate both the public and the private sector. I think the level of innovation pioneered by dual-use companies is absolutely tremendous. It's powered by a number of factors. I'm sure many of them are on your mind right now. Things like AI, things like the growth of renewable technologies, also renewed interest in the space, in sort of developing space or going to space. And of course, it's worth mentioning. Hi, Caryn. Thank you for. We were reflecting on whether you were in the motorcade or just delayed by it. Or of course, it's worth adding another factor that is really motivating the growth of these technologies is increasing concerns about geopolitics. So it definitely feels, as we're thinking about the panel tonight, that there has really never been a better time to talk about all these sort of different topics than right now, because of how much innovation and also because of how much opportunity, but also challenges are faced by these dual-use companies. We will talk about regulatory engagement. We will talk about business government development. We'll talk about sort of how these dual-use companies are trying to balance, sort of achieve some sort of operational balance. We'll talk about the policy changes on the horizon. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to thank a number of people, starting with the DC Tech Week team, who has been is the umbrella organization for this event. I also want to thank Walker Sullivan, Kristen Salvier, and Lauren Rugani from Regent Craft, and Tom McIntyre, Colleen Reynolds, and Yi Zhu from the NYU team here in DC. I'll also mention that we don't have, because we have a wonderful panel and we have a set of questions, or 4 rounds of questions, as you'll see in just a second. We won't have time for an open Q&A at the end of the panel, but all of the speakers have gratefully agreed to join us for the reception upstairs after the session. There will be a reception upstairs, and you can find them and ask them directly the questions that you have for them. So please, first of all, join us for the reception, and secondly, make sure that the speakers find the speakers and have a conversation with them. All right, so for this discussion, I'm joined by 4 great speakers with very, very different backgrounds, and I'm sure a very complementary perspective. So from my left, Tom Huntley. He is the Vice President for Government and Defense Relations at Regent Craft. Before Regent, Tom was on the serving on the House Appropriation Committee on behalf of the Coast Guard, and he's a retired commander from the Coast Guard. Caryn, I have over there. She is the she is a space consultant. I have to say, Caryn, you have the absolute best title that I can think about. You know, who wants to be anything else when you can be a space consultant? Space consultant and strategic advisor for Stoke. Also vice president for regulatory and government affairs. Before this, she was vice president at regulatory government affairs at Relativity Space. Also senior counsel and senior director for space flight policy at SpaceX, and deputy to the associate director for legislative affairs at the White House OMB. Chris, next to Tom, is a partner at Point 72 Ventures. In his role, he's also an investor and board member at Shield AI. All right, I'm going to try to make this work a little bit better. Investor and board member at Shield AI, investor and board member at Overland AI, and also an investor at Regent Craft and an investor in Stoke space. And then last but not least, Dave Clarke, he's a policy editor at Punchbowl News. Before that, Dave was an editor at the Washington Post, and also a financial editor at Political and Finance Reporter at Reuters. All right, so for the first, thank you again. Thank you all for joining me this evening. For the very first round of questions, I want to ask you a little bit about your background and a little bit about what you're doing right now, just to get a sense of where you're coming from and your point of view. Tom, I'm going to start with you. We met during a course right here on campus at NYU, the NYU DC campus, and I was absolutely fascinated both by your background, but also by the fact that you're working for an amazing company, Regent Craft. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience at Regent and also why you think we should think about it as a dual-use company?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you, Cinzi, for being here. Thanks for everybody. Thanks for my fellow panelists. So at Regent, we're building the Sea Glider. It's an all-electric wing and ground craft. You saw the model when you walked in. So this craft is capable of transporting 12 people with zero emissions, nearly 200 miles on a single charge in about an hour. What's so exciting for me and for our team is the ability to see the direct impact on commercial transportation, really revolutionizing coastal connections. 40% of the world's population lives in coastal communities, yet the transportation and connectivity between those coastal communities is broken. It's too long for a traditional ferry. Driving is questionable, and it's not efficient or effective on either a sustainability or a cost standpoint to use traditional aircraft. So that value proposition to really change coastal transportation, connections between Boston and New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Inter-Island Hawaii, Japan, Middle East, Mediterranean, really is so exciting to be at this cusp of innovation that has impact. The electrification produces a transportation solution with zero emissions, but it also has a economic and market-driven solution, and that's first and foremost. It's not enough to be sustainable. You have to actually solve a market problem. And the electrification, while sustainable and zero emissions, actually significantly reduces operating costs. And that first and foremost increases reliability, decreases ticket pricing, and therefore fundamentally opens up the market to a wide swath of customers. Okay, so you asked about dual use. Well, all of that value proposition for moving passengers and cargo safely, effectively, efficiently, all applies directly into the maritime defense space. So the reduction in operating costs and increase in reliability is just as important in the civilian sector as it is in moving troops, Marines in and out of harm's way in the Indo-Pacific. Making sure that vital equipment, sensors, you name it, gets into the littoral area as tensions perhaps are increasing. And I think personally, most importantly, can safely and effectively get injured soldiers and sailors and airmen, Marines and Coast Guardsmen and everyone out of harm's way if and when that happens. And so what we've really found at Regent is our value proposition spans directly across the civilian and military verticals. And I'm personally proud, having served in the military, that we can provide a solution into that space. So as a company, it's it broadens our revenue stream. It does all that business and market value. But from a societal and a global impact, we can shift the mentality and really shift the impact of economic, environmental, and across the civilian sector, while we simultaneously create a value proposition in maritime defense.
Chris, I'll turn to you next. From your experience, what makes you dual use companies attractive to the VC world? And perhaps if you want to reflect on when did the VC world become interested in investing in defense investments?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me here. So our firm invests in both defense tech and dual use technologies. Actually, we invest mostly in defense tech. That is companies that almost exclusively service the national security community or the DoD. You're actually looking at two of the few examples where we've invested in purely dual use technology, which is commercial first or largely commercial and or potentially split between commercial and DoD. Now, it's really been interesting to watch this ecosystem evolve over the past 10 years, over the past 15 years. I think 15 years ago, you can use the eVTOL market as a proxy. Maybe initially when they were trying to develop electric craft, they didn't quite realize the defense applications there. And there are quite a few. If you're an eVTOL, you're quiet. All the benefits that Tom here mentioned more broadly about things that apply into the dual use segment. But now I think startups from the beginning days realize that they are in fact dual use and are eager to serve the national security community. And part of that shift is also belying the reasons why VCs are now interested in dual use defense tech. So dual use, i.e. commercial technology that has national security applications, spans a wide variety of different sectors: cybersecurity, AI infrastructure, energy, mobility, space. It's pretty prevalent nowadays. You'll find that companies who previously didn't really consider the national security system to be a viable market to now have large portions or primary portions of their business in that segment. Now, what makes national security attractive to VCs? Well, we've been investing as a firm in the space for the past 5 years, and our managing partners were actually former In-Q-Tel, which is a nonprofit investing arm that's affiliated with the intelligence community, have been investing in the space before that, before joining our firm. We've seen a shift, I think, probably since 2022 in the ecosystem in terms of overall investor interest in defense tech. And what's been going on, what happened in 2022? Well, first of all, we're particularly conscious of that here, being Washington, D.C., was the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians and sort of stoking interest in national security technology because you see the real geopolitical implications of that. The next sort of interesting thing that was going on in 2022, more from a macro perspective, is the market was pretty much in a funk. ChatGPT hadn't yet come out. The AI boom hadn't yet happened. There was a hangover from the rise of interest rates, the end of what's known as the ZIRP era, and that largely depressed deal making. With the exception of the national security sector, that again, at the end of 2022, you saw 3 large rounds announced where really there wasn't much other activity. The first of which was, I can't remember which order they came out, but it was basically Shield AI, Anduril, and another company called Vannevar Labs, all raised relatively large rounds at relatively healthy valuations when there was just no activity. And so you saw at the time a depressed market, really the rise and crystallization of the importance of technology within national security, and then companies that were essentially being very successful. And that subsequently filtered out to the broader ecosystem and a lot of excitement around defense tech and dual use technology, which continues today. There are other macro trends as to why this is happening now, and it wasn't happening 5 or 10 years ago. Namely, technology has matured to a point where it can actually make a significant difference in the geopolitical calculus and in geopolitical competition. And then also, you've seen it recently accelerate, especially over the past year and a half with the Replicator Initiative and OSC and the maturation of the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU. But overall, there's been a shift really since DIU was stood up in the 2010s. Of the DoD and of the national security community more effectively engaging with startups and becoming more effective at acquiring technology from emerging players and non-traditionals. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done there, but there's a lot of progress that I think folks are more optimistic than they have been previously, and we're continuing to see additional progress along that line.
Caryn, if I can turn to you next. How would you help us think about the industries that where we're most likely to see dual use companies, and from your experience, what makes a strong dual use company?
Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons we see such interest in dual use. Really, if it wasn't clear from what Chris said, it's all about the money. So, I mean, the defense sector, if you look at budgets and you look at your potential government customers, so if you're focusing on, if you think that you have something that is interesting to the government, and you look at the budget of the Defense Department, and if you're in space, you look at the budget of NASA, there's no question where you want to be. So I think that's a key aspect of it. But another is how they do business. And a really important aspect of the growth of the space industry and the growth of dual use capabilities in the space industry. So, and when I think dual, it's actually tri-use pretty probably, because we think of space as civil, commercial, and national security. Those are the three sectors that we look to respond to. In some cases to one, often to two or all three. And on the in that regard, one of the big facilitators of opportunity for startup companies in the growth of the proliferation of new companies entering that space is the opportunity to do business with the government in a more commercial-like manner. So the government's put forward, especially on the defense side, just as recently as, I think they released earlier this year, their strategy for commercial space services, a strategy for engaging with commercial companies. And that really boils down to a really nerdy topic, which is procurement and how the government procures things, whether it procures them in firm fixed price through firm fixed price contracts or through the what has become, but wasn't always, the more traditional cost plus contracts. And firm fixed price contracts, especially firm fixed price services contracts, give commercial companies the opportunity to hold their IP, to leverage their services, to sell against other customers and clients, to hold the government accountable with regard to its requirements and build something that is commercially viable that services not only the government customer, but also a commercial customer and maybe a different part of the government customer versus something that is bespoke built for a DoD customer, which is what the Defense Department really largely does when it's not thinking about the opportunity to engage with the commercial sector. For large procurements, we're talking billions of dollars of procurement. So one of the things that this, so that's really an important piece of the space puzzle. I think that, when I think about, the answer to the question, why has SpaceX succeeded, for example, so well? And one of the reasons why SpaceX has succeeded is because it has only done business so far with the government in a commercial manner. And it's really paved the way for a proliferation of companies that have, even people that have grown up in SpaceX and then gone off and started new companies, or at the very least has encouraged the government customer to behave in this more commercial-like manner. And that's kind of unique to space versus some of the other industries that build really hard, complicated technologies that service the warfighter. And it's not true for all of space. We do still have major prime contracts that are firm, that are cost plus contracts that are built bespoke to the government. But I think that's a big difference. And so when you start getting into the opportunity to develop something that you can leverage, like the Falcon 9 rocket, for example, Stokes reusable second stage, which is really interesting to the commercial market, but very necessary in the long run for plans for the warfighter, that those are capabilities that you can leverage to provide the government a really good value for its dollar while answering a commercial need. And I think that's really where space has been unique. You don't build an F-35 for commercial purposes, right? You build a F-35 specifically for the government. You don't build most ships for the Navy that are being also built for cruise, right? We don't cruise on battleships. So space launch and spacecraft are really pretty interesting. It's also a place where you see activities happening on the civil side that are in furtherance of our national security interests. And there's a lot of thought that happens on the policy level about those dual use capabilities, that we want to facilitate NASA's investments, and this dates back right to the ISS Cold War days. We want to facilitate NASA's investments in technologies that the national security apparatus will benefit from, but we don't want to call it a defense technology. So there's also some nuance there in the space industry that's kind of interesting, where we want to send, for example, lunar rovers, we want to send lunar landers, we want to be on parts of the lunar surface because we want to beat or also be there with some of our adversaries. And we're not doing that through our Defense Department. We're doing that through NASA civil service, through NASA civil space programs. as part of our efforts to continue to signal that space is supposed to be for peaceful purposes, that we're going to abide by the Outer Space Treaty obligations, that we don't build military installations on celestial bodies. So there's some interesting overlays of policy, both at the international, the domestic level, and then there's fun things like procurement policy that all play into where we are in the space industry right now.
That's great.
At least they're interesting to a nerd like me.
Dave, how, we've already heard a little bit about changes that have brought us here, but how do you think about how the landscape for dual use companies has evolved?
Well, I think politically there's a lot more interest in it. I mean, we talked about, them funding for the war in Ukraine and how that sort of stimulated it. I think there's a few different factors. One are the geopolitical. There's a big pressure, especially on Capitol Hill and in the administration, both the current one and certainly the incoming one, to compete with China. So when we're talking about innovation, there's a lot of interest there. I think also when you're talking about small companies and innovators, there's also a lot of pressure on Capitol Hill to sort of embrace them more than the larger companies, like specifically say big tech. So for instance, I think it was this past week that you saw Senators Elizabeth Warren and Eric Schmidt of Missouri, two people who don't really share much in common, introduced a bill that sort of would force the Pentagon to update its procurement process to make the cloud computing contracts more competitive, to invite in more small companies. And that's sort of, I think, a reflection of not wanting to just have Amazon or just having Oracle in there. And I think some of the panelists have mentioned too that, a big thing is that there's going to be a lot of budget pressure in the next few years. I mean, that's, we have the DOGE committee and people are talking about cutting trillions of dollars, which likely won't happen. But regardless of all that, the one area that's not going to get cut is going to be defense spending. If anything, that's going to go up. So you're going to see, we may not have the war supplementals that kind of juiced up the defense budget, but certainly there's going to be a lot of interest in the Republican Congress and the Trump administration in spending a lot of money on defense and these type of contracts. And I think it was this past weekend, they finalized their annual defense policy bill, and there are several sections in there that promote the use of dual-use technologies. So I think it's something that's attractive to lawmakers, and I think that right now there's sort of politically a good moment for looking at these, whether they're startups or mid-sized companies, as opposed to the sort of traditional huge contractors who will certainly still get their money, but there's maybe a little bit more to spread around.
To both you and to Caryn, when we think about dual-use companies, because they serve both a government client and private clients, their interests don't always align. So what do you see as the main tension points, and how can dual-use companies, navigate those?
Well,
Sure. So if we sat here for a while, we could probably brainstorm a lot of ways, especially if we engage some MBA students. But I think that, when I think about it, it really boils down to a couple of key points. One is that how you do business. Two is the requirements. So what are the requirements that the government puts on the contractor, and how detailed are they? How bespoke are they, such that, you are not willing to really lean into the government side of that dual use, or that you have to lean back from the commercial because you've made something untenable, like just not marketable in the commercial side. And so then it really becomes how are you doing business with the government? So to what degree are they controlling the use of your asset, or controlling the technology of it, right? So we think of popular topic, of course. My students last year really wanted to talk about Starlink. I teach space law. They were really interested in Ukraine and Starlink. And, how could they do that? How is it possible that somebody could decide that they were or were not going to provide a service? Answer is, well, legally, are they obligated to do so? Are they violating their contract? And people can choose to violate contracts to provide a service or a good, just by virtue of doing that and accepting the risk and the repercussions of that. But generally speaking, the first order of business is it actually a violation of the contract or the agreement that you do or do not provide services with your capability, and how do you provide those services? And so I think that's an important, point for anybody who's in a dual use business and providing I'm going to stick with services versus goods because it's a little bit different to hand over a product than it is to provide a service. I think that's an important distinction about what I'm talking about. So when you're providing a service and that service provides both commercial capabilities and government capabilities, the operator of that service may be in a constant state of evaluating the risk to their business based on either aspects of that service. So are they, in providing it to the government service, to a government entity, putting themselves, for example, at risk of being targetable under the laws of armed conflict? And if so, is it worth raising that risk and having their activity or their capability and service being targeted in a way that could interfere with their commercial business and the commercial capability? And so I think that's something that that is an important piece of the dual use question, and one that policymakers grapple with and that business people and operators grapple with from my standpoint.
That's a much better answer than I was going to give. But I would say, as far as tension points, this would be for smaller companies, but obviously, the Defense Department and other departments have tried to make it easier for smaller companies to work with the government, but it still is difficult to kind of go through that procurement process. And I guess myself, I'm kind of curious to see how much that changes in the next few years, if it becomes even easier, or if the actual kind of government contracting bureaucracy remains in a way that's just sort of makes it too expensive or too difficult for small dual-use companies or any company to sort of do business with the government.
Chris, how does, from your perspective as an investor, how does the due diligence differ for a dual-use company when you compare it with a single-use? And do you ever find yourself kind of encouraging a company that hasn't recognized that it's a dual-use company to go in that direction?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. And so at Point72, we invest in a handful of different areas. I run the defense tech strategy. We also have an AI and consumer strategy. And then we also have a growth team that's a little bit more sector agnostic. And there are times where I'll talk to folks on more so on the AI, less on the consumer. There aren't as many like dual use apps out there, although they do exist. So more often I'll potentially engage with folks on other parts of our portfolio who are interested in the defense sector and sort of advise them on what they need to do. But I will say that there are some interesting similarities between defense companies or dual use companies and commercial companies. So I spend most of my time investing in the early stage. That's usually companies that are between 0 and 4 years old, I want to say. They're generally sometimes pre-revenue. They have a little bit of revenue, but not much. And so what is the primary thing you look at when you invest in those companies? And you ask any early stage investor, and 9 times out of 10, they'll say it's the team. And so we look at the team and we look at both their ability to build a business as well as be technical. Even better if they have both. Spoiler alert, both Regent and Stoke have CEOs that are incredibly technical, but also have a tremendous grasp of how to actually build a big business in their particular sectors. And they have a knack for convincing the world of their worldview, even though before they started, other folks might have thought it was not possible or not really seen the vision right away. So we look at the team, both their ability to navigate the business sector, to paint a compelling vision, as well as do they have the technical chops to do something really, really hard. Next, we talk to customers, and turns out talking to defense customers is very similar to talking to enterprise customers. I could talk to a CISO and basically ask, hey, what are your pain points? What do you wish existed? Does this particular business or technology that we're looking at solve your problem? Mm-hmm. I can talk to a service member, a flag officer, a DoD civilian that's in charge of a program office or a PEO, and I can ask the same question, and they'll basically say similar things one way or another. So regardless of which sector you're in, you're talking to customers, you're evaluating the team, and you're making assessments on the overall market. Is it so uncompetitive that the incumbent is so entrenched that it is almost impossible to dislodge them? I'll say that in defense, there are a significant amount of incumbents who are there. However, they tend to move much, much slower than other new companies. you ask, is this a large market? Is this a growing market? And here is where I'll talk about some of the differences. So in defense, it is simultaneously more open and less open than it would be in the commercial sector. How is it more open? Well, budget documents, defense budgets are public. There's this thing called J-books where they do the best they can. And I say the best they can because, as I found out, they're actually incorrect, but it's the best we got. They list out future spending plans for specific defense programs and specific defense areas. Sometimes you have to use your imagination to figure out exactly if a particular pot of money is applicable to one technology or another. They broadcast their, for the most part, broadcast their problems like from the hilltops, at least the services and the customers that are most easily accessible from startups. Now, there's the Space Force in particular has actually been tremendously effective at describing its pain points and then taking the initial steps of starting to invest behind them. There's still ways to go when it comes to scaling technologies and scaling programs, but they've made meaningful progress. Other services, like the Navy, God bless their heart, has a harder time articulating those problem sets. And so sometimes you have to prod a little bit more to really understand exactly where the opportunity lies. But largely speaking, the national security establishment tends to be really open about their problem sets. Hey, we need better missiles. Production is a problem. We need to adopt autonomy. We need to coordinate with autonomy. These are all things that, if you look at hearings, if you look at articles, are talked about every week. Well, what's different? Well, sometimes barriers to information can be hard. So I mentioned some customers being open, some customers being closed. Part of that has to go to culture. Part of it has to go with administratively how they're set up. But for example, in the DoD, there are reams of people who believe that they are not allowed to talk to industry. They are allowed to talk to industry. Absolutely. There are overclassification issues. So many times, specific problem sets or capability gaps or answers to capability gaps are behind a top secret wall. Even worse, they're behind what's called a special access program or special access wall, where other people who are similarly situated don't know that a capability exists or a capability need is there. And so it becomes challenging from the outside to determine exactly where those capability gaps are. And so a lot of it's the same, but there are a fair amount of differences.
Great. Tom, if we turn to you, at what point in the innovation process does it make sense for a company to start thinking about being a dual use company? How do you think about that process?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally from the very start, and sometimes that's hard. I think there's a difference between thinking about it. So the founder or founders have their idea. Maybe there's a dual use aspect, maybe there's not. But I think keeping an eye, because it's not just keeping an eye on the government customer, it's also keeping an eye on the government more broadly, because there are always regulatory issues. There's always going to be government influence, whether it's the state, local, tribal, territorial, international. So thinking about government more broadly, I think from the get-go is critical. And in doing that, I think a company can identify, is there a defense or government customer base? And then there's some pretty tricky questions that have to be answered. And that is how much of our very, very, very limited resources at the seed and pre-seed can we put into are we going to validate that? Are we going to invest? Because everything's an opportunity cost, right? So, and as I think Dave mentioned, it's hard. It takes a lot of time and energy to do all that work that you were talking about, to look through the J-books, to do that research. That takes personnel, that takes time, that takes capital. But I think thinking about it from the beginning versus moving along and then all of a sudden saying, oh, hey, we've got a whole defense vertical that we can apply to. Sometimes you're a little behind the ball there. The other piece that I think is critical goes back to requirements. So what are the government requirements, and how much is the startup willing to adjust to meet those requirements? You could try to meet every single requirement, but now as you mentioned, the product is no longer viable due to cost or capability in the civilian market. So now do you have are you going to do two production lines? Are you going to do two design teams? Are you going to have to worry about facility clearances and the expense and process that goes on with that? So it's really a balancing game. Now, ideally, you've got a solution that, and this is idealistic, but that meets both customer needs completely. Now, is there ever any product that meets a customer's need completely? I mean, I hope so. I think so. But it takes a lot of self-reflection from an organizational standpoint to be able to decide, yes, this is an area that's worth investing in. Okay, so once that decision's made, then what does that investment look like, right? What kind of talent do we need to bring in? Because it's a long game, right? I mean, there's a lot of work in the government space now that brings in those avenues. So small, relatively speaking, small business contracts, SBIRs that are in the $500,000 to maybe $2 million range, that can help feed some research and development. You have to apply to those. You have to wait. It's a long time. And if you're really looking at, following and really disrupting that prime, the Lockheeds and General Dynamics and all of that, it's probably a 5 to 10 year process. So when companies are brand new and there are so many problems that are just this week, how much investment do you want to put in that long-term game? The long-term game that can pay huge dividends. I mean, the Defense Department's budget is enormous, nearing $1 trillion. So if you want to get a little slice of that, that's great. And it serves, from a company standpoint, it serves as a risk mitigation. The Defense Department contract can mitigate macroeconomic factors. If there's recessionary pressure, if there's inflationary pressure, so it can be a risk mitigator. But it takes those resources, and so it's the decision-making process to decide, yes, this is somewhere that we want to put our resources into, and then bringing in that talent that can do it.
I want to build a little bit more on that and think about the role of the government explicitly, and turn to you, Caryn, because space used to be essentially a government-only venture, and now we see so much collaboration and interaction between government and private actors. Can you talk to us a little bit about that transition?
Yeah. So the story of that in the U.S. is very much about how it goes back to, again, how the government chose to do business. And actually, Tom's comments reminded me of an important point, which is the role of government R&D dollars that are non-dilutive dollars early in a company's fundraising efforts. And I think Chris already mentioned DIU and some of the other organizations that have helped companies, especially now, identify opportunities in the government to partner early stage and do those, do some of that R&D work to buy down some of the technical and operational risk on a product or service that you want to bring to market. And so that's pretty important. And, we saw that happen very thoughtfully and specifically with the way that NASA structured its procurement and R&D effort, followed on by a full acquisition procurement for services with the commercial cargo program to serve the International Space Station. And they did that by using other transaction authorities, again, procurement nerd here. So OTAs, which allowed SpaceX to continue to own its IP, non-dilutive R&D dollars, and that money fed into a phased development of technologies that then led to a services contract for cargo delivery to the International Space Station. And SpaceX was able to use that, and of course, investment dollars, leverage that for investment dollars, plus Elon, and build the Falcon 9. And the Falcon 9, because it was built to service a commercial market, was actually able to enter the commercial launch services market and eat the lunch of pretty much everybody else that was in that market. And the people that weren't in that market were the U.S. providers of launch services, Boeing and Lockheed Martin with the Atlas and the Delta, who had created a joint venture in order to be able to even survive, called the United Launch Alliance. And the United Launch Alliance was servicing the U.S. government launch, national security, had a monopoly on that, and then also servicing NASA science launches. And then we were otherwise, in some cases, sending payloads abroad to fly on Arianespace, which is the European Union's launch capability, and even, of course, sending astronauts and cargo at this point on Russian spacecraft and Russian rockets to the International Space Station, because after the shuttle retired, we had no capability to reach the space station. So it was kind of a perfect storm. You know, I have clients who come to me, or potential clients, because sometimes they don't hire me after I tell them this, that say, okay, well, Caryn, you were there, you helped make that happen. How do we make that happen? And my answer back is, what is the very unique product or service that the government absolutely has to have that you are prepared to provide? Not something that you want them to want, or that they think that they might want, or that would be a nice to have once you develop it and bring it to market. But what is the thing that they are saying, screaming from the hilltops, that we want? We don't want to rely on Russia anymore. We really want somebody to provide this service to us. We don't want to pay that much money for it. Please, 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 somebody come bail us out of this problem. And that is where SpaceX landed with regard to NASA and the International Space Station and the United States at the time. And it wasn't all like easy and rainbows and unicorns, but that's really what was the real kind of cornerstone of that success, in terms of, you know, breaking into the market and leveraging it, and the fact that the government had little dollars. So that was the other piece, is the early development dollars were actually small dollars in the scheme of things, right? You know, tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. It did follow on a multi-billion-dollar contract, but the early investments were small dollars to prove little pieces of technology. And so that led to SpaceX and the Falcon 9 being able to recapture the market. And then we've had, of course, Rocket Lab come in and really succeed in the smaller launch capabilities. And we're seeing a proliferation of other companies. So now we have Stoke, of course, on. There are a number of other companies that are building launch capabilities to service the national security, civil, and commercial market. And we have also, by virtue of SpaceX and Falcon 9's success at providing highly reliable and highly affordable, relative to other launch providers, affordable access to space. So if you're not familiar with this, because, well, it's a good chance you're not, you know, SpaceX's Falcon 9 was being sold on the market for launch in the tens of millions, so like around 50 to $75 million for a launch, depending on what was being launched and who the customer was, with the Falcon Heavy being up in the, you know, $125 million range. That was versus a Falcon 9, maybe even lesser capability in the Atlas, which was $250 million, right? And a Delta 5 Heavy, Delta 4 Heavy was like 500 million plus. So, you know, they came into the market and were able to do things in a commercial-like manner. They completely changed how the launch industry builds launch vehicles. So instead of integrating pieces from a bunch of different places, they, you know, moved to building most of the items in-house. So very, very integrated approach. Test to fail, not test to succeed, right? So you test and you fail, and then you learn your lesson and you move on, which is not a government approach to testing in the past. So they really kind of, it was a lot of things that revolutionized the approach to building spacecraft and space and delivering space capabilities. And we're seeing that in other areas of the dual use market. So I think there are excellent examples of other companies who, you know, may have been doing that at the same time. I just wasn't paying attention because, well, when you're at SpaceX, you're only doing SpaceX. But I certainly, when I've come out of that and looked up and looked around, I certainly see other companies that are providing services and really thinking about how they innovate and in some cases hold the government at bay with the requirements in order to be able to develop their technology and their operations in a manner that are not overly burdened by too much government involvement.
Chris, thinking about the government as a funder, right, not just as a client, the DoD, for example, has several funding opportunities for small companies that, you know, can use that funding to accelerate the development of very interesting and innovative technologies. Can you talk to us about how DoD funding affects your decision-making in terms of entry, like, or not yours specifically, but the VC world's decision-making in terms of entry, exit, and rounds of investments?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing that we've seen in this particular ecosystem, which is compared to purely commercial companies, if you're tackling a problem set that someone in the DoD cares about, and that someone is attached to a customer or an organization that's actually relatively effective at dealing with startups, a lot of ifs, but you can actually get interesting sort of R&D, SIBR type, prototype, OTA, and I'll get to that in a second, type contracts and actually get a decent amount of revenue in the door before your technology is matured and before you've actually built a product. Now, we found that many of our startups are able to sort of take advantage of various sorts of contract vehicles. So SIBR, which is a small business innovation and research grant, is one possible vehicle. It comes in a few different phases. They start off as low as $50K. Oftentimes, the next phase will be $750. It could be up to $1.5 million, and then potentially it could go greater than that. Oftentimes, we'll see startups use this as sort of a paid pilot. You know, there are folks that sort of just write these contracts and go off in a different direction. But if you're using it effectively, you're seeing this as an initial way for your interested customer to try out your technology, to help develop it, to give you feedback, and to engage your customer set. And it could actually be relatively interesting for you as a startup. They get a bad rap by many folks as seeing them as like innovation money without sort of a pathway forward. However, if used correctly in that sort of paid pilot way, they can actually be very effective. Next is another contract that's commonly called an OTA, and without getting too far down the rabbit hole of what an OTA, the Transaction Authority, is, it was developed for NASA, I think in the 60s, to field technology quickly. It developed a resurgence, I think, over the past decade, and is a way to sort of sidestep a lot more onerous type contracts called the FAR to be able to deal with emerging technology players a lot more quickly. And we've seen OTAs rise within the DoD within the prevalence of use. And there's an interesting analysis that actually compares different branches and how frequently they issue OTAs. And it compares the Space Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And that analysis in terms of how OTAs were used by each service is probably the first time I saw a proxy for what we knew intuitively, which is different services have different abilities to deal with emerging companies. And I will say that with the exception of the Army, which I believe has a distortion due to a large COVID contract, the rest of the services map correctly in terms of where how effective they are at engaging with startups. And it's a gentleman named Austin Gray. He wrote the analysis, OTAs by service. I recommend you look it up. It sort of maps to what I say. Space Force and Air Force are actually pretty interesting. The Army and the Marine Corps somewhere in between. The Navy has virtually none. There are other contracts that are issued by DIU. For example, they do a commercial CSO or commercial solution offering, which is tied to their programs. And what we've seen with all these sort of smorgasbords of contracts is startups being able to go from a pre-product, just idea phase, to actually a meaningful business that can support a seed business, a Series A, which is typically a milestone associated with product market fit, a Series B, which is additional sales proof points, usually with growth of top line. And we found them to actually help promote this broader ecosystem. Now, they're not enough, right? Like the whole point of what we're trying to do when we, as a VC, we need big outcomes. We need companies to, at the end of the day, be robust businesses that are growing substantially, that have high margin, that have a high top line. Essentially, those initial prototyping contracts have to translate to what's called programmatic spend. What's basically programmed into the budget for specific line items. And, that is still, there are folks that have gotten there for portions of their business, but it still happens too infrequently. And we need to see additional sort of proof points there.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? Are you ever worried that a government contract, if it just grows too big, will have provisions that will stop that company from being dual use and kind of not service the private market as well?
Well, that's an interesting point. So, like I said, we often actually invest in defense tech companies or defense only companies. So that the part of it's that they don't have that sort of dichotomy where it becomes hard to necessarily service both customers. I think the issue that Caryn brought up, which is one, engaging too far down the defense path potentially makes your infrastructure a possible casualty of conflict, is a serious question that certain folks have to consider. But I think it's a separate issue than I think what you're referring to, which is something called government purpose rights. Right. Essentially, there are certain rights IP provisions within certain contracts that allow the government to essentially take your IP and possibly farm it out to a competitor. Now, for a company, regardless if you're commercial first or regardless if you're defense first or dual use, it is very important that you know how to negotiate that appropriately and that you avoid sort of the government purpose rights and you have other provisions in there that protect your IP and protect your data, because frankly, that's the only way that you'll be able to protect your business, scale your business, and ultimately deliver critical capabilities to the national security community. So it is something you have to be very careful with, but it applies regardless if you're defense tech or dual use, because you're essentially trying to protect your business and make sure that you can function and grow.
Yeah. And to both Tom and to Dave, thinking about the relationships with governments with the government as barriers to entry, right? How do you think about smaller companies, startup companies, breaking into working with the government, sort of developing that relationship, and then, or essentially the same question, how do startups navigate Washington so effectively?
I'll just kind of focus on what our specialty is at Punchbowl News on Capitol Hill. I mean, obviously a big way about it is either having a good government affairs shop yourself or hiring one. You're going to want to be able to have someone that can get you into the right committees, the right congressional offices, so you can tell your story, kind of convince these people to become your champions. Depending on the size of the company or where it is, sometimes that comes down to whether or not you're going to be creating jobs in someone's district or state. That's a good way of sort of getting your company on someone's radar. But, a lot of it is obviously relationships. You see plenty of people kind of go between government and industry. If you're on Capitol Hill, you need to be able to get that person who can get you in the door so you can tell what you presumably feel is a good story to tell, whether that's for some sort of specific pot of money for your company or just for a broader topic that would benefit your company. I think that's sort of obviously like a tried and true way of if you're a company of trying to build relationships, at least on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'd build on that. I mean, one, you need a compelling story. You're exactly right. I mean, you have to have a compelling story, a compelling solution to some problem in the market, and that market is whether it's defense, commercial, dual use, whatever. So compelling story, I think number one. Number two, you need to know how the process works. Who's who.
Yeah.
So whether that's hired out with a consultant or an in-house, somebody somehow mapping out how, essentially how a bill becomes a law, right? And if we're focused on the Hill, how do the different processes work? How does the committee structure work? All of that. And same thing in the executive branch. How are DoD budget decisions made? You can't just walk into the Pentagon and say, hey, I would like a contract for X, Y, and Z. It just doesn't work that way. One is you can't get into the Pentagon. And second, even if you can, sometimes those budget decisions are made 3 years in advance, sometimes 4 and 5 years in advance. So you have to really map out. So compelling story and map out how the process works. And then third, I think you need to answer the parochial question, right? And that parochial question might be jobs in a district, right? The parochial question might be, member so-and-so sits on the Defense Appropriations Committee. That's a different conversation. You still have your compelling story, but you have a different conversation with an appropriator than somebody who, in our instance, somebody who is, fully dedicated into the environmental space. Our story is still compelling. We're still a transportation solution that lowers cost, that creates efficiencies in the marketplace, that can move Marines in and out of harm's way. If I'm speaking to the defense appropriator, I'm probably going to expand on that part of the story, that last little bit. If I'm talking to the environmental policy person, I may talk about, hey, this not only decreases costs on our operators, but also will remove however many tons of CO2 per year as an ancillary benefit to this market-driven solution, right? So knowing your audience and your issues, and that becomes part of that broader compelling story. And finally, you need to have an eye on what's the goal. What is it that your company needs from government stakeholders? So could be the Defense Department and getting in the budget cycle. That could be creating relationships with the decision makers in that SBIR space, so you can get in front of those decision makers and kind of pitch your compelling story. And it may be, hey, there's a statutory or regulatory challenge because perhaps there's one section of statute that says one thing and another that says another thing, and they're in conflict. So maybe your ask is actually non-funding related at all, but it might be to create a pathway for regulatory reform because you've got this new product that doesn't fit neatly into the way that the committee structures or the executive branch oversight or the regulatory space has been built over the last essentially 50 years or so. And so I think you need all of those. So how do you again decide as a company when is it time to bring in, and how do we bring in that ability? I mean, I think the compelling story kind of has to be there no matter what business you're in, right? But that roadmap and that understanding of the stakeholders and messaging in particular, I think that needs to happen earlier. I think as a company, I think if you're thinking, should we do that? You're already a little bit too late.
Yeah. I'd like to spend the last few minutes that we have together, and we'll wrap up after this round of questions, thinking about the policy shifts on the horizon. So Caryn, to you, how would you advise a government relations team to prepare for the policy shifts ahead?
Yeah, so we have a lot on our policy docket in the space industry right now. So I think a big piece for us is something that is impactful across all sectors, but is one that can is sometimes just thought of as commercial, and that is the question of who authorizes activities that are not our traditional space activities. So when you're not doing something by and for government, which means that your government customer is sponsoring you to engage in this activity, right? Authorizing you to go to space, so to speak, or to go to the moon, or to do whatever it is that you're going to do in space, then who approves your activity? And the entities that do that right now are the FAA for launch and reentry, the FCC for telecommunications, the Commercial Remote Sensing Office within NOAA for remote sensing telecommunications at FCC. I think I've said that backwards maybe. Anyway, so we have those three, but then we have all of these activities in space that are emerging activities, some of which we've already started to engage in, like rendezvous and proximity operations for satellite servicing, which is definitely a dual use technology. Lunar landers, commercial LEO destinations definitely have some dual use capabilities there. Those are activities. The idea of a spacecraft that can go up, deliver things in orbit, and then maneuver around to deliver other things or pick things up. Some real interesting mobility capabilities that are of interest, definitely on the national security side, and have some commercial capabilities. We have not perfected a clear authorization for a government agency, federal agency, to review and approve and provide some kind of permit, license, authorization for an entity to do those activities that is doing them outside the auspices of the government sponsorship, or even as a provider of services to the government in a commercial manner. Because, by the way, a lot of the activities that are provided to the government that are dual use are being licensed as though they are commercial capabilities, and then selling services through those commercial capabilities, commercially licensed capabilities, to the government customer. Starlink is an example of that. Launch is an example of that. There are tons of them. So that's a big issue for us. And we had a proposal come out of the first Trump administration, Space Policy Directive 3, that pointed everything at the Commerce Department. We had a proposal out of the Biden administration that pointed to both the FAA, split it up between the FAA and the Commerce. I have a good feeling that we're going to be looking back and seeing a proposal that goes, VFR to Commerce only. And but that's a big deal because we have a lot of activities that are being planned to go to space in 2025. And even if it's not 2025 and it's 2026, we really need Congress to give us an answer on whose door are we going through and who's going to be able to approve these activities definitively. And we need to stop having to kind of mash together different agencies and be creative, especially given some recent Supreme Court decisions about how creative agencies can be with their authorities. So that's a big deal for us in the next year.
Chris, on the investor side, how do shifts in public policy affect how you or the VC world more broadly thinks about their investments in this area?
Well, it can have quite a substantial effect. So, as we mentioned before, the NDAA, which is the policy document, just came out this past weekend and has several provisions that expedite certain authorities, codify other authorities to basically lubricate the system to make it move just a little bit quicker. I think looking forward where there's additional work that needs to be done is, number one, the mechanics of getting a contract and working through all the appropriate provisions and getting that contract issued, and then subsequently getting money sent to the performers on the contract takes way too long. And I think there are certain cultural and administrative reasons why that is, and it doesn't necessarily go to leveraging certain pots of money and making them bigger and moving money around. So I think those specific issues when it comes to why the machinery doesn't quite work as quickly as it is need to be tackled, and that's on the personnel level, that's on the incentive level, that's on the education level. So I think that's quite important. Next, we see a shift towards away from buying more exquisite, more expensive systems, and then looking to buy commercial solutions under a firm fixed price structure where they're essentially bought for cheaper, they're bought for in greater quantity, and they're bought at a higher velocity that subsequently supports a commercial ecosystem providing different capabilities. And our current policy is largely geared towards that sort of exquisite side with the cost plus contracts that we mentioned before, and it needs to be geared more towards the high velocity firm fixed price aspect. The last thing we'd like to see change, or that I think would have a substantial effect and continue to increase investor appetite and interest in this space, is that movement more quickly from the R&D research money to that larger programmatic spend. Right now, we see there's a tremendous lack of non-dilutive capital, particularly when companies are scaling. So at the early stage, everybody's excited about dual use and defense tech, so they just throw a bunch of money at a lot of these companies, which is great for folks who are looking to deliver critical capabilities to the national security environment. But I think as companies scale, sometimes that capital can become a little bit more scarce. So quicker movement, more non-dilutive resources available, I think will be tremendously healthy for the ecosystem.
That's great. Tom, you're in charge of the government's relations team and stakeholder engagement much more broadly than that. Can you walk us a little bit about your stakeholder engagement strategy for 2025 and beyond?
Certainly. So obviously there's been and about to be a tectonic shift in Washington, D.C. with not only the Trump administration and changes in policy and doctrine, but also shifts in the Senate control, and what might be most pivotal is a shift to a even more narrow Republican majority in the House, which right now is going to be one vote until at least the vacancies are filled with special elections. So that is the tectonic shift that we're all experiencing right now. So from a company standpoint, how do we navigate all that? Well, it goes back to what I said before. I mean, really mapping out what are the priorities, who are the players, and a lot of this is shifting right now. So it's a lot of unknown, and that unknown translates to risk. It's managing the expectations and understanding of our employees who see shifts and see unknown as scary. I mean, that's human nature. Investors see the same thing as risk. Well, how are you going to navigate if you're this green company? How are you going to navigate if a bunch of IRA funding is clawed back? And I think it fundamentally goes back to what I said before, which is a compelling story, and it's a compelling story because it's a market solution. So I fundamentally believe that our market solution withstands the political waves because it's a solution that will solve a problem in the economy, not necessarily just in the political environment. All right. But that's all fine and good but it's not enough. You really, we as a government team are spending many hours and had many conversations over the last 6 months mapping out what are the permutations of the 2024 election and how does that affect our strategy in 2025. So we kind of mapped out what if it is the blue wave, what if it is a shift in the House and the Senate and all of that. I'll give a plug. I mean, Punchbowl it has helped us from a immediate standpoint get the news of Washington politics, and you add that onto the more broad national space. And so paying extraordinarily close attention to what are the political drivers, and then mapping out our comm strategy to those realities. So what does that mean? Well, we're a carbon fiber, high tech, domestic manufacturing opportunity that will bring hundreds of jobs in the next few years. Well, that fits right into onshoring manufacturing. Our dual use in maritime defense, well, that fits right into countering China from a defense standpoint. None of this has changed. It's not like we just made this up in the last few weeks when we were trying to watch the dust settle. This has been true since we've kind of started our government process. But it is critical now that we continue this compelling narrative because that's the market-based solution both in the commercial space and in the defense space. And then finally, our job is to mitigate and lessen perceived risk, right? Whether that's from our employees, from our government stakeholders, from our investors, is to be able to articulate internally and externally, how are we going to navigate this new political reality over the next number of years, and how are we going to be successful? And so I think first knowing your true fundamental value statement, knowing your stakeholders, and knowing their interests, and mapping to all of that is really how we're looking at it. And I fundamentally believe we're going to be successful because I think it spans beyond the political and really into the broader economy.
Dave, we'll end with you, and I'll ask you to wrap up for us. We've heard a lot this evening, and what are your takeaways for things to watch for, and for members in our audience who are working for these kind of companies that are trying to be successful in a dual-use space?
Sure. I mean, I was kind of struck by my panelists are much more smarter and know more about this than I do. And I kind of took away was that seems to be a tremendous amount of opportunity, but also it's still sort of difficult at different times for companies, especially smaller ones, to get involved. And there's, been work towards making it easier to deal with the government, but more that needs to be done there. And I think just kind of picking up on what you said, the new Trump administration in a lot of ways will be undeniably good for businesses big and small. There's going to be a big effort on getting rid of regulations across the board. There's going to be, we talked a lot about the defense budget. It's a big source of money. It's almost undeniable that will just continue to grow. But there's also just it can be erratic. I'm kind of curious. We didn't talk about it, but for certain companies, depending on what tariffs are put in place, maybe that's something that's going to be a problem. So I think there's, there's probably a lot of opportunity with the Trump administration coming. You were saying maybe they simplify, bringing things back to commerce. But, you have Elon Musk, who's, obviously probably an ally of the dual use industry. But, who knows, a week from now, we're going to see a tweet that says, I hate Elon, he's gone. So, it can just be a wild ride. But I think it'll be fun for my industry, I guess.
Well, unfortunately, we're all out of time, so that brings us to the end of this session. I want to ask you to join me in thanking once again our panelists for being here this evening. Thank you to the audience, those here and those online, for joining us, and thank you to the organizers for making all of this possible. Thank you again. And I want to remind everyone here that we have a reception set up for us upstairs. The speakers will be joining us for a while at the reception, so please feel free to find them and ask them your own questions. Thank you.